Dr. John Schneeberger. On the night of October 31st, 1992, 23-year-old Candace Fonagy walked into Kipling Memorial Hospital in Saskatchewan, Canada, for what she thought would be a routine medical appointment with Dr. John Schneeberger, a well-respected physician in the small community. Schneeberger greeted her professionally, gestured toward the examination table, and prepared a syringe filled with Versed, a powerful sedative that paralyzes every muscle while keeping the mind fully conscious. He injected the drug into her arm, and within seconds, Candace felt her body go completely limp as the medication flooded her system, turning her arms and legs into dead weight she couldn't control, no matter how hard her brain screamed at them to move. Schneeberger pulled off her clothing and took advantage of her while she remained unable to scream or fight back. When the drug finally wore off and sensation crept back into her limbs, Candace collected her underwear and sealed it inside a plastic bag, then drove for hours to a crisis center in Regina, where nurses performed a complete examination, swabbing and documenting the semen while Candace recounted what had happened. Weeks later, police brought Schneeberger in for DNA testing, and a technician tied a tourniquet around his upper arm, tapped the vein in his elbow, and drew blood for comparison against the semen from Candace's previous tests. When the results came back, they showed no match whatsoever, and police delivered the devastating news that DNA evidence had cleared Schneeberger. Candace refused to accept it and demanded a second test, so in 1993, police brought him back in while officers stood watching as the technician drew another vial of blood that went straight to the lab under careful supervision. The second test returned identical results, showing no genetic match. In 1994, a third blood draw at the forensics laboratory produced samples that caught the technician's attention because the blood exhibited strange oxidation patterns and degradation markers that made it look like it had been sitting in storage for days rather than flowing fresh from Schneeberger's veins. Despite these unusual characteristics, Saskatchewan police didn't pursue the anomaly any further and officially closed the investigation in 1994 after declaring that 3 separate DNA tests had proven Schneeberger's innocence. However, Candace hadn't lost hope. Weeks later, she hired private investigator Larry O'Brien, paying him from her own funds to pursue leads law enforcement had abandoned. O'Brien broke into Schneeberger's car one night and found a tube of chapstick in the ashtray, its surface covered with skin cells from Schneeberger's lips. Private lab testing showed the DNA from the chapstick matched the semen from her original examination with absolute certainty, proving Schneeberger was guilty. The evidence was inadmissible because it was obtained illegally, but it gave Candace leverage to force a fourth supervised blood draw. During collection in November 1996, the phlebotomist inserted the needle into Schneeberger's arm and immediately noticed the blood showed heavy coagulation markers and looked like old stored blood rather than fresh blood pumping from veins. At trial in November 1999, Schneeberger confessed to his deception. He had surgically implanted a 6-inch long Penrose drain, a flexible plastic tube normally used to remove fluid from surgical wounds, directly into his arm along the pathway where technicians draw blood. He positioned the drain beneath his skin so that when needles were inserted during DNA tests, they would pierce the tube instead of his vein, drawing blood from the implant rather than his body. Inside the tube, he had filled it with another man's blood mixed with anticoagulants to prevent clotting. This surgical trick fooled 3 separate DNA tests over 4 years until a technician finally noticed the blood didn't look right. The breakthrough came in April 1997 when Schneeberger's wife discovered he had been drugging and taking advantage of her 13-year-old daughter, finding hidden boxes containing syringes, gloves, and vials of Versed in his office. When police arrested Schneeberger, they drew blood from his finger instead of his arm, bypassing the fake blood tube, and collected hair and saliva samples that all matched the DNA from Candace's rape kit perfectly, finally giving her the proof she had fought for since 1992. Colin Pitchfork. On November 21st, 1983, 15-year-old Linda Mann's body was found on the Blackpad footpath in Narborough, Leicestershire, showing clear signs of exploitation and strangulation. 3 years later, on July 31st, 1986, another 15-year-old girl named Dawn Ashworth disappeared while walking to a friend's house less than a mile from where Linda had been murdered, and search teams found her body 2 days later in 10 Pound Lane, strangled in the same brutal pattern. Police arrested 17-year-old Richard Buckland, who confessed to Dawn's murder but denied killing Linda. So investigators contacted Dr. Alec Jeffreys at the University of Leicester, who had just invented DNA fingerprinting technology. Jeffreys compared DNA from the semen samples to Buckland's blood and discovered that Buckland hadn't killed either girl. Still, both murders had been committed by the same unknown man, making Buckland the first person ever exonerated using DNA evidence. Weeks later, Leicestershire Constabulary launched an unprecedented mass DNA dragnet, requiring every male between 17 and 34 years old living near the murder sites to provide blood or saliva samples for genetic testing. Over 6 months, more than 5,000 men lined up at collection centres where medical staff drew their blood and sent the samples to laboratories for analysis. Colin Pitchfork, a 27-year-old married baker with 2 young sons who worked at Hampshire's bakery, knew he was on that list. Pitchfork approached his co-worker Ian Kelly at the bakery one afternoon and explained that he couldn't give blood under his own name because he had already given a sample while pretending to be a friend who wanted to avoid police attention over an old burglary conviction. Pitchfork offered Kelly £200 to show up at the collection centre with forged identification and give blood while pretending to be Colin Pitchfork. Kelly agreed and walked into the DNA collection centre, carrying identification with Pitchfork's name and address. Medical staff tied a tourniquet around Kelly's arm, inserted a needle into his vein, and drew blood that filled several vials labelled with Pitchfork's information. The sample went to the laboratory, where technicians compared it against the genetic profiles from the murders, and the results came back showing no match, clearing Colin Pitchfork's name from the suspect list. At the same time, the real killer continued decorating cakes at the bakery, having fooled the DNA institution. 6 months later, in August 1987, Ian Kelly was drinking at a Leicester pub with friends when the conversation turned to the ongoing murder investigation that had consumed the community for years. Kelly had been keeping Pitchfork's secret locked away, but the alcohol loosened his tongue, and he started bragging about how he'd pulled off an incredible deception against the police. He told the group gathered around him that he'd been paid £200 to take a blood test under Colin Pitchfork's name, describing in detail how he'd walked into the collection centre with fake identification and fooled the medical staff into labelling his blood sample with another man's information. A woman sitting at a nearby table overheard Kelly's drunken confession and realised she was listening to someone admit they'd helped a potential double murderer evade the DNA dragnet. She left the pub and went straight to the police to report what she'd heard, and detectives immediately began investigating Kelly's story. On September 19, 1987, police arrested Colin Pitchfork at his home and brought him in for interrogation, where he confessed to murdering both Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, plus exposing himself to over 1,000 women throughout his life in a compulsion that had escalated from indecent exposure to sexual assault and finally to murder. Joseph DeAngelo. On June 18, 1976, Joseph James DeAngelo pulled on his police uniform and reported for his shift at the Auburn Police Department in California, where he spent his days patrolling neighborhoods and responding to calls like any other officer in the small community. What his fellow officers didn't know was that at night, DeAngelo broke into homes across Sacramento County, tied up residents at gunpoint, and exploited women while their families lay bound and helpless in adjacent rooms. Between 1974 and 1986, he attacked more than 120 homes, attacked at least 50 women, and murdered 13 people across California, operating under different names that investigators didn't realize all belonged to the same person. His police training taught him exactly how to avoid leaving useful evidence and how to control multiple victims at once by cutting phone lines and disabling alarm systems before entering through unlocked windows and side doors. In 1986, DeAngelo's crimes suddenly stopped. He vanished into suburban life, working as a mechanic and raising a family in Sacramento while detectives struggled with cold cases they couldn't solve. For decades, his DNA sat in evidence lockers extracted from crime scene samples, but it never matched anything in the DNA database because the database only contained profiles from people who had been arrested or convicted, and DeAngelo had never been caught. However, after having lived a peaceful life for more than 31 years, something happened in December 2017. Detective Paul Holes and FBI lawyer Steve Kramer uploaded DNA from a 1987 investigation to GEDmatch, a free public genealogy website where people shared consumer DNA test results to find relatives. The killer's DNA matched 10 to 20 people who were distant third cousins, sharing great-great-great-grandparents from the 1800s. Genealogist Barbara Ray Venter and her team spent months building massive family trees using birth certificates, marriage records, and census data, working forward through generations until they narrowed suspects to 6 men. FBI agents pulled driver's license photos and found only one with blue eyes matching survivor descriptions: Joseph James DeAngelo. On April 18, 2018, detectives followed DeAngelo to a Hobby Lobby parking lot and swabbed his car door handle after he went inside. Days later, investigators collected his discarded tissues from his garbage can. The DNA from both samples matched crime scene evidence perfectly, and on April 24, 2018, deputies arrested 72-year-old Joseph James DeAngelo in his side yard, ending a 44-year manhunt. Delroy Grant. On the night of October 1992, an elderly woman living alone in her South London home woke to the beam of a flashlight blinding her eyes as a figure stood over her bed in the darkness. Delroy Grant, a 35-year-old father who worked as a caretaker and lived with his wheelchair-bound wife, had disabled the electricity to her house before breaking in through a back window, moving through the rooms until he found his victim asleep. Grant spent the next several hours terrorizing the woman, attacking her in her own bed before searching through her belongings and stealing cash and valuables that he would later use to support his family's ordinary suburban lifestyle. This attack marked the beginning of a 17-year reign of terror that would see Grant break into more than 200 homes across South London, specifically targeting elderly victims in their 70s, 80s, and 90s who lived alone and couldn't physically fight back against his assaults. Grant's attacks followed a distinctive pattern that police recognized immediately. He disabled electricity, entered through windows, used a flashlight to disorient victims, and never wore condoms during his sexual assaults, leaving DNA evidence at dozens of crime scenes. Operation Minstead collected more than 2,000 DNA samples from suspects between 1992 and 2009, comparing each profile against the rapist's DNA recovered from victims' bodies and clothing. In May 1999, police received a crucial lead when Grant's car was spotted near a burglary scene, and officers traced the vehicle registration to Delroy Grant's home address. They ran his name through the police national computer and discovered a coincidental match. Another man with a similar name whose DNA profile happened to be in the national database. Police compared that other man's DNA to the crime scene samples and found no match, which led them to mistakenly eliminate Delroy Grant from their suspect list without ever collecting his actual DNA or interviewing him directly. This clerical error and confusion over similar names allowed Grant to continue attacking elderly victims for another 10 years, committing 146 additional offenses, including 23 more sexual assaults, before police finally arrested him in November 2009 using improved investigative techniques and database cross-referencing that caught the mistake.